Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Tonight we're joined by New York Times bestselling author Michael Capuzzo, one of the most respected voices in true crime and investigative storytelling. His work is known for taking real cases and bringing them to life with the kind of detail and depth that puts you right inside the investigation. And that's exactly what he does in The Murder Room. In this book, Michael takes us inside a real-life group of elite investigators, the Vidocq Society, where profilers, forensic experts, and seasoned detectives come together to tackle murder that have gone cold for years, sometimes decades. These aren't just stories. These are real cases, real victims, and real attempts to find justice long after the trail has gone cold. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cameron. Thanks for having me on.
So, Michael, I ran into this when I was, or the Vidocq Society, when I was actually interviewing a book by Troy Hillman, who wrote about the canal murders, and their department, the Phoenix Police Department, actually used the Vidocq Society to gain information, create a profile, and they ended up solving that case. And they gave them a lot of credit. When was the first time that you found out about this society?
It was around 2000. I was a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter. Before that, a Miami Herald reporter. I hate to say I was a reporter because I think they're all liars now, but that's just me. Sorry. We could talk about that. And before that, I was born in Boston. I'm going the whole story. And I was lucky enough to get to these great newspapers. Went to Northwestern University Journalism School. Fast forward, I was lucky enough to write a New York Times best-selling book called Close to Shore about the first shark attack in American history, the true story of Jaws. And I was looking for another story. And I was drawn to true crime. I was drawn to mysteries, James Patterson, what have you. And I was looking on the internet, of all things, because I lived in Philadelphia, and the Vidocq Society is based in Philadelphia. And up this website that says cuisine and crime. And that's how I discovered them.
I wanted to get into some of the background of the society members and how it was founded. So it was founded by three gentlemen who were all former investigators. And I believe I've heard you tell the story before, but this kind of started with a lunch date between peers, right?
Right. And Bill Fleischer was a sort of 300-pound former FBI agent and head of customs at the time, when they called it, right, in 3 states, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey. And one of his best friends, Frank Bender, who some of your audience might know, was a very famous forensic sculptor for law enforcement. And they were having lunch and kicking around the idea of having, which ended up being the Vidocq Society, of having a group of renowned investigators from around the world meet once a month to go over cold cases over a fancy gourmet lunch and eventually go out in the field and try and solve them. They roped in a third figure as the founder, who was Richard Walter, who is known as the living Sherlock Holmes, as I heard that said at Scotland Yard when I reported the book, and at NYPD, a forensic psychologist who is a real character and brilliant at crime assessment. He doesn't like the word profiling. So the three of them got together and they wrote to all their friends in law enforcement, and all of a sudden you had 70 or 80 people having dinner, inviting the Kansas Bureau of Investigation or the Tennessee Police Department or a small town department that couldn't solve a case to present it over lunch, and going out in the field to try to solve it.
Yeah, and they're actually successful in this, which is the work that they do is amazing. I wanted to actually put a picture up of, I think this is probably one of the more popular models that Frank Bender did, which he's passed away now, but this was John List. And for those that are listening, he murdered 5 people and then fled. And then decades later, Frank was asked to make a model of what he would appear like in modern day, and he got it down to the T to include what kind of glasses that he's wearing.
That's a great summary, and it is one of the more exciting cases. John Walsh of America's Most Wanted called Frank Bender and asked him to do that reconstruction. Killed, you're right, 5 people. It was his mother. Wait, I'm sorry. I think his mother, his mother-in-law, and his 3 children in a mansion in North Jersey. And then just the last evidence law enforcement had was I think, his overdue parking ticket on his car at Newark Airport. 18 years, 50 state European investigations by the marshals and everybody else, nothing. And then Walter, the living Sherlock Holmes, and Bender, and oh man, they are such characters, both of them, spent a day collaborating on. Bender would say, well, what kind of glasses would he wear? And he would say, just like mine. These, that's what he just talks like Sherlock Holmes. And would he be fat? Oh no. He would be but he would still be eating. He never went to the gym, and created this portrait that Frank turned into clay. And I think they caught John on List within 11 days of that broadcast, when his a friend of the wife, John List's wife, said, "My God, that's my neighbor."
That's so fascinating that you can do that. And I know that, I believe it was you who said that Frank also has dead people talk to him.
Yeah, I remember when I first met these 3 fascinating, law enforcement guys, gentlemen, and talked about doing this book with them. We were at a coffee shop in Philadelphia, and Frank Bender is he's a renowned FBI investigator, but then was a head of, 100 special agents for customs or whatever. So he's sort of the organizer, the bureaucrat, federal bureaucrat. And he introduced his partners, and he said, this is Richard Walter. He's our living Sherlock Holmes. And this is Frank Bender. He talks to dead people. Only God knows what he does. And then of course, Bill, who's a Jewish joking kind of guy, said, I'm just a heavyweight Jewish kid who grew up reading, true crime, comic books in my basement, self-deprecating jokes. So they were all characters. But yeah, Frank had an unbelievable ability to sense, for I don't know what, who knows. I mean, it's a spiritual quality, spiritual ability, psychic type ability, because he would be sitting with and the way it started for him is he was wandering through he was close friends with Hal Fillinger, who was a very renowned coroner in the city of Philadelphia, and he was getting a tour once when he was an art student trying to study anatomy, like Michelangelo was studying bones in the basement or something. And he said, we'll never know what this would look like, because, and Frank said, I know what she looked like. And he went from there.
That's just so amazing. And I don't know if I believe in psychics, but when I see that and then the results, it's like, it's mind blowing how you can produce something like that. But yeah. I wanted to go through some of the cases that you mentioned in your book. One of them is the Scott Dunn case. And that was from 1991 in Lubbock, Texas. Do you want me to give you a little breakdown, refresher on the case, or
sure, go ahead. It really helps.
All right. So with Scott, the puzzling thing about this investigation is he was found in his apartment. His girlfriend, I believe, was the one that reported the crime. The police knew that, or believed that he had been murdered because of the massive amount of blood that is in the apartment. And there's also pieces of carpet that had been missing, but they didn't have a body. And in Texas and in most states, it's very hard to get a DA to get on board with charging someone for murder when you don't have a body. But Scott's dad, he reaches out to William actually on this, and he explains what's going on. And one of the first questions that William asked him was, when did this happen? And he said, well, it happened a year ago. And William had to break the news to him that one of the rules of the society is that it has to be 2 years or older because they don't want to interfere with police investigations, which is actually very noble and courteous of them to. They're not out for the fame. They're not trying to go into these smaller departments and show off their capabilities. They're letting the police do their job. And then when the police are at a complete standstill, which for them they decided was a 2-year time period, that's when, if the police are willing to ask for their help, then they'll actually come in and provide resources to them. So William explains this to him, and the father is clearly upset. But because of the father's drive and determination, he asked William, "Would you, at least look this case over and point me in the right direction?" And I believe that's when Walter
Right,
joins
right,
in on this as well.
right. What happened is William Fleischer, the president of the Vidocq Society, which, like you're right, they only work at the behest of law enforcement and with law enforcement. And there's a lot of famous people who had, Scotland Yard members and so forth, so they didn't want to show off. They're just trying to help pro bono. So, so William Fleischer sent Scott Dunn's father to Richard Walter, and Richard Walter met with Scott Dunn's father in a Philadelphia hotel room. And Scott Dunn's father is a very successful businessman, originally from West Texas, and had sent his son Scott. He's a good-looking guy, I describe him as kind of a blonde Tom Cruise, and he had a lot of fun in high school, but he was one of those kids where his dad never knew what was the next phone call. Like, it was a DUI, it was, all kinds of unserious trouble unless it gets worse. And it got worse. So his dad said, well, why don't you move to Grandpa's place in West Texas? It's an innocent place out there. And he got involved with the wrong woman. And this woman is a psychopathic killer who pulled the number on him. So flash forward to the father sitting down with Richard Walter, the detective, who I spent 7 years with doing this book. And he talks like this: "Madam, if you're going to eat that butterscotch candy, I would have you put it in your mouth now. I will not have plastic twinkling whilst I attempt to discuss murder." So he's a real character and quite a genius. And Scott Dunn, the father, laid out this trail of blood and deception. And Richard looked at him through the haze of his cool cigarette you see there, and said, "Mr. Dunn, let me ask you a question. Why are you acting like the grieving father?" And he said, "Well, that's what I am. I don't know what else to do." He said, "We can deal with your emotions later. But for now, fuck that. The bitch killed your son. Let's go get her." And
that is so awesome.
And that was the beginning of their investigation, which took a number of years, and Richard putting in hundreds of pro bono hours, and flying out and dealing with, the police and the young detectives, and convincing them that this 108-pound woman who was being so cooperative with the police could really be a psychopathic killer. And she'd pretty much know the police at that point.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about this group as well, is that, like you said, this is not a simple luncheon that they're doing one time. These are
Right.
hundreds of hours that they're doing when they could get paid a lot more being consults for someone.
Right.
And so that in itself is very impressive. When we're going back, they eventually are able to gather enough evidence and consult with the DA, and they are able to take out charges. Do you want to provide us with the details of that?
Sure, because it is kind of fascinating. Basically, Richard Walter went into the DA, and the DA said, "You don't have a case, the living Sherlock Holmes." So Richard went back to one of his contacts, who was a good friend of his, who was the Queen's coroner at Scotland Yard, and he's one of the top investigators in England, and asked him, what's the way around this? Because as you alluded to earlier, I mean, they found the body, the body's gone, and the young woman who he's living with is like, "Oh, I don't know what happened to him." And meanwhile, they did a luminol test, and there's enough, blood on the walls everywhere that, it looked like it got washed in by a hurricane and got flooded. And when they ran that test, and it turned out it was Scott Dunn's blood. And so what the Queen's coroner figured out from Scotland Yard for Richard is that you should convince the DA that the blood is the body. You need a body, and here's the proof that this is the body. It's the same DNA, the same cellular structure. This is Scott Dunn. And on that basis, they were able to bring this historic case and get a conviction.
That's such an interesting way to look at it, too. It makes complete sense because at some point, you cannot survive without a certain amount of liters of blood in your body.
Right.
And
Right.
when you can articulate that it surpasses that amount of survivability, I think that is a good logical conclusion that that person is dead and their body may not be found. But in this case, it actually was years later.
Right. It was many years later, and they, Richard had to, what he would often do. By the way, the book, I don't know if I mentioned it. The book is called The Room, and in many of the cases, Richard would go into a small town, and I love the blue line right behind you. So there's none of this is criticism, but in many cases, he'd go into the small town, and the chief or the top veteran detective might be resistant to this character and his theories. But eventually, there'd always be a young detective in the background whose eyes were wide open, and he'd start following Richard around like a puppy dog. And this happened in Lubbock, Texas. So what Richard said is, "Take me to the psychopath." And they brought him to the Iron Kettle. It was the restaurant where the eventual convicted murderer, this woman, was a waitress. And the police brought their young daughter back and put her in the back seat. And Richard turned around and said, young madam, I see you're quite attractive, but really not that attractive. And so I have a question for you. It seems like in your history that you've had a lot of men, this way, that way, all kinds of ways. My question for you is, are you a sexual Disneyland? And this woman was like, actually she had a very impressive, but it revealed her personality. She immediately shut down like a clam and hopped out of the car and shut the door. And it was a way for Walter to probe, this is a psychopath. How skilled is she? How tough and is going to crack? So that's the kind of things that they did to win this case.
Yeah, and you're completely right about the dick measuring contest that happens in law enforcement where it's, no, this is our jurisdiction or they don't want to deal with it type of thing. That happens
Right.
all the time. And that's something to keep in mind with this society and why it only works when a department is voluntarily asking for their help, not when they are reaching out to the department. Because a lot of departments won't share anything unless it's public record. And
yeah, I guess maybe now that you mentioned that from your perspective as a law enforcement pro, the real deal, I never thought of this, but maybe one of the reasons Vidocq Society is successful is by the time 10 or 20 years gone by, the chief and the people there they want to solve a cold case, but they can, often it's Officer Johnson, Officer Epstein is about to retire, and this has haunted him for 20 years, and he wants help. And they agree,
And that's what's so good about those departments that do solicit their help is that you've got people that are making calls to top corners in the world for advice and for information. You're not going to get that in Lubbock, Texas.
Right.
And I think also just in any department or any investigation, when you start looking at something through one lens and just a single perspective and everyone is on board with the same theory, that can be damaging too for investigation. So bringing someone from the outside that's not from that area, that has these other experiences, and especially guys like Richard, who has his whole helix we can go into about sexual deviant behavior, which I assume he never shared with you, or were you able to actually look at it?
Boy, you have a nose for news, because he wouldn't. I did the reporting on this book for 7 years, and he finally did share it with me. And probably not in exclusive detail, but more than anyone else had. And I remember he opened up this, he had one of those Halliburton, steel-ribbed briefcases he carried in, and it basically was he did more theoretical description of it, but basically was a way he could describe the descent to hell from somebody who's a panty sniffer, like I think wasn't Bundy that or whatever, all the way down to this insatiable desire that had to be fulfilled by Bundy cutting off the head of some woman who had just the right look and masturbating on her skull in the fireplace because he still was such a control freak. He didn't want to risk his heart, even when she's dead, to be vulnerable. It sounds awfully corny or maybe too coarse, but I think Richard Walter is maybe the greatest mind in the world at understanding how that type of person operates and how to catch them.
Right. So I know I kind of jumped to that without giving it some background, but the helix that he came up with is, what would you describe it, like some type of pathway of looking at behaviors from someone being young to when they become a violent offender and looking at actions that they're going to possibly pursue in between?
Right. I mean, he and Robert Keppel, who, became pretty famous investigating Bundy and the Green River Killer out in Washington State, were best friends and collaborators, and they came up together with a system of profiling that they believed was transcended the FBI's, and I don't doubt that it did. But similar and they had 4 classifications of killer, like power assertive, number 1, and fantasy killer. And there were 4 different types, and the third was it'll occur to me, but the 4th one was where you go down into the depths of hell, because the 4th one is someone who isn't killing for power or money or anything, but is killing just for the thrilling of killing, sadism. And that's where Walter went off independently and developed this, I guess you would say, roadmap, Rosetta Stone, to how this person descends down into that hell, for hell for everybody.
Do you know why he hasn't released that out? Does he not want to patent it and provide that there are people, or is this just something that?
Well, I'd asked him that. I asked him that many times, and his basic response was he said he doesn't want to give the bad guys their learning curve. He said when he makes lectures about sadism, very often the sadist, maybe even a suspect, will be in the audience because it's a learning curve. I'm just doing this out of my ears here at the moment, but if you don't know how to play the violin and there's a master who can show you the steps. I mean, sadism apparently grips people and grips this sort of dark heart in a way that's insatiable, and they have to grow and they have to find the next phase of delicious, perverted thrill, and they don't know what to do with it. And there's a pathway, and he doesn't want to describe that pathway because then people will start following it. He wants to just give it to, closely tested investigators who hopefully can use it.
Right. And so for those future offenders who do study other serial killers and they're learning from this and trying to become better, it reminds me of Israel Keys, where Israel Keys was actually studying how to be a better offender and studying what law enforcement was doing and changing his techniques to the point of learning that, okay, I can't kill in Alaska. I've got to go to these other places. I've got to develop alibis that are solid. And so he would do it around vacations. He would even have kill kits that he put around the U.S. But he's the type of guy who, if he saw this online, he would absolutely take advantage of something like that.
Oh, wow. That's a great point. I haven't heard a portrait of someone who is trying to learn like that. I just thought it was a theoretical, and it's what Richard said, but that makes perfect sense. And it really does make perfect sense.
So I want to talk about another one that is in your book, which your book was out in 2010, I believe. But again, it's called The Murder Room, and it's available on Amazon. Is it on Kindle and Audible?
Sure. Yes. It was read by, it is on. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so you can pick that up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere where you can get a book, including Audible and Kindle. Make sure you go get that. It can also be found at your local library, like I did.
Right, there you go.
But one of the era cases that you covered, which I found fascinating, was Terri Brooks. And Terri Brooks was a waitress. She was working for
Oh yeah, Roy Rogers.
Roy Rogers. All right. So she's working at a restaurant at Roy Rogers, and the parent company was the Marriott. And so she had some upward mobility if she was able to work hard. So she's feeling good about herself. She ends up being murdered in 1984. This occurred in Pennsylvania. And what was unique about the murder is that she's murdered inside the restaurant. She's got her jacket on. There's a bag that's placed over her head, and she's beaten severely. I believe she was also stabbed. And so there's multiple ways that she could have actually died. With the doors being locked and the drive-through window being secured, they didn't know if this was a robbery that had gone wrong, but they come to a complete dead end. I'll put it that way. For 15 years, this is a cold case, and I'll let you take it from there.
Well, Richard Walter was brought in, and Richard's genius is to see when they call him the living Sherlock Holmes, and when you read even the fiction, it's always the same, right? He's looking past the physical evidence to sort of the heart of darkness, and he's reading what would be the motive. And he concluded that it was a spurned fiance who would let in late at night when she was cleaning up or closing down. And he concluded from the signs of the body, and they eventually got a conviction. It's
yeah. And what I thought was interesting about that is that I've heard him talk about how when you're looking at motives and why people kill the way they do, right? Like if this was a robbery and they wanted to kill her, they would have just shot her and fled. When offenders actually spend the time to essentially assault them, then you know that there's that personal relationship. And those are things that were overlooked for 15 years. But then luckily in this case, you've got to remember this happened in 1984, where DNA technology was not available. And so in the late 1990s, when DNA technology gets better, and this case is reviewed, they were able to, one of the investigators remembered that there were skin or some type of body fluid under her fingernails. And so they were able to go and retest this. And that's when they were able to hit on Alfred Scott Keefe, who was the fiance of hers. But he was not even on the radar because the parents in this case thought that she was dating some other guy. Is that right?
Yeah, the parents were sort of fooled too. But it is Richard's great insight into into the human heart. Just parenthetically, remember another case the Vidocq Society took on where I forget the exact details because they didn't go in deep into it like these cases we're talking about, but it was essentially two boys who were 14 and 16 who one accidentally shot and killed the other. And even Bill Fleischer, the FBI agent, was saying, oh, well, it was just an accident. There was just, these are good kids. They live in the suburbs or whatever. And Richard's like, oh my God, man, you're too naive. This was a homosexual love triangle, the kind of thing where you cut right into the dark possibilities that none of us want to think is happening in River City, and that's Richard's gift. So in this case, he can sense the anger and the fury of a rejected fiance and how it can lead to that and how it can express itself on the body.
When you're talking with him and you're seeing these things happen, do they happen that quickly, or does he spend weeks analyzing reports and really thumbing through and coming up with a theory, or does he just process things extremely quick?
He does process things extremely quick. It's a little bit of both. If I were to say, listen, I heard about this, and I think, wouldn't that be a power assertive killer? He would be all of a sudden, I can't imitate him. He'd be all of a sudden raising his right eyebrow to let you know that you had it wrong. And right from the beginning, he's got a glimpse of how it works. I remember another case to illustrate that. Maria Khalil, I think, was her name, and she was a brilliant, beautiful young woman who was studying at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, to be a vet, and she was murdered. And Richard immediately was able to figure out the likely killer, who to this day I don't think has been charged, and show the police that they had, of the 40 people they'd overlooked, they'd interviewed, he jumped out at Richard. And he went to a hotel room in Champaign-Urbana to school them on all this and tell them how to redirect or suggest how they might redirect their investigative resources. And I remember saying to Richard, well, were they happy? What did you think? Did they believe you? Oh, yes, they were happy as a pervert with two dicks. That's Richard's personality. He was a prison psychologist for many years before he evolved into this sort of super profiler. And so he still has that down-to-earth sense of humor, behind bars of humor, But
was there any case that you were looking into? We call them great white whales, cases that are still unsolved, and one that you've continued to look at or continues to kind of bother you or you think about?
Well, one great white whale, which is a great description. I wish I'd known that. I would have worked that into the book somehow. It's a great lingo. It was Jack the Ripper, in that he was contacted. He had a lot of friends, at the Scotland Yard, and they put together a superstar lineup of profiles and stuff to try to solve it at the 100th anniversary. And he was on that all-star lineup, and he believes he knows who did it. And we'll go on at quite length about that. But of course that's frustrating because that's never going to be solved. But and there are others too. As we talk, come to mind, that he would love to still solve.
I assume these guys are still going hard, and I know the society has grown to the point where they're doing seminars, which is great, and this is all pro bono work, and where detectives can bring their cases to these seminars, and they do break-offs, discuss the case together in group settings, and then they're able to get these reviews. Are you still involved or in contact with them at all?
That's a good question. Actually, yes, I'm in frequent contact with Richard because the Murder Room has ended up being a big hit in Hollywood, and a lot of great books never get made into TV series, but we've been led to believe a number of times that this might happen. The producer of CSI, the woman, $26 million a year, producer, whole CSI franchise, said that when she read The Murder Room, she learned more and talking to Richard Walter about her than known in 13 years producing those shows. And she's had a crack at what do you call it, producing it, and get it accepted by CBS, and then the people at the head of the producers of another big famous show, the Law and Order show, and then finally Apple TV has been trying to the producer in Apple TV of what their biggest hit, one of their biggest hits, The Morning Show, is trying to make it a TV show. So I'm in touch with Richard about this, and of course we're friends, so I see him for dinner now and then, and I hear about, he's in his 80s, but he still has a nose in, and people call him, and he's still as capable as ever.
Yeah, it's very fascinating just to hear these stories and hear the mannerisms. And I finally saw a picture of him and a picture of kind of the room that they do this in. I think that that in itself just it sounds like a TV show. Just this
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
idea of bringing in people from that are the best of their field for lunch, and you're watching a slideshow of evidence from a case. I mean, that doesn't seem like reality.
right. It sounds like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and so forth.
Right.
And the profiling, and Richard, the insights he has on profiling. I remember in the John Litt case, like we both briefly touched on, he had killed his entire family. It was one of the most sensational, media hyped killings in that era. It was the 80s, early 90s, and no evidence anywhere. And Richard, when you ask about, he just looks at 10 or 12 TV, 10 or 12 what do you call it, TV, but also newspaper accounts of the crime. He'll get a chance to look at the records, but he pretty quickly comes up with the idea, and he said this guy would have gone at least, I don't know, if it's 2,000 miles, whatever he said, away from the crime, and settled and become a clerk at a motel, because he would be able to keep his anonymous quality of, have a job, but he's working nights and no one even sees him. And then he would work his way back into a Christian church, because he'd been a big church member in New Jersey, and he would hornswoggle one young woman into marrying. He found he moved from New Jersey to Colorado and became a night clerk at a hotel, and joined the Christian church and became and hornswoggled the naive young woman into marrying. And then he said he would eventually move back to within 250 miles of the crime, because he would need, own it. He would need to feel like it was his territory. And he moved back and was caught in Richmond, Virginia, about 240 miles or something from North Jersey, where he did the crime. So when Richard does those kind of things, he would actually say, and such a character would say, yes, well, people think we're some sort of Merlin, that goes back into a room but anyway, but it basically was a lot of hard work, a lot of understanding of hundreds, if not thousands, of previous cases and behavior patterns that he was able to bring to the fore to make it so. It's not, but when people called him the living Sherlock Holmes, he would say, I said, what do you, and I'd seen it happen. What do you think? He said, well, when people tell me that, I kind of like look stricken, as if someone has farted in the room, So Richard's a character, if nothing else.
Yeah. And I know the criticism of profilers is that they're not detailed enough. I've had Julia Cali on the show, who is a consultant a profiler with the FBI on a part of their behavioral analysis unit. Extremely smart, but I don't think that, and I'm going to have her on in a few weeks and I'll ask her this, but I don't think that she would ever be able to predict that many details about someone's personal life, to include the mileage that they would move back to, and then be right. If I heard, right. Making up that many details, not making up, but predicting that many details, I would call bullshit on that. And then,
yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting
to happen.
It's interesting you say that about, speaking of calling bullshit, because both he and Robert Keppel, who was state attorney's investigator for Washington State that first got onto Bundy, and wrote a book about how he used Bundy's insights to help catch the Green River Killer. So a major figure, right, in law enforcement. Was very close friends, and I had dinner with them both a number of times and interviewed Keppel about Walter, and they wrote their peer-reviewed paper about their profiling ideas about murder, sexual murder. But Richard was also close friends with Robert Ressler, the FBI, the famous FBI agent who was one of the founders of the Behavioral Science Unit. In fact, I saw Richard's copy of Ressler wrote a book, I think the title was something like He Who Tracks Monsters or something. And I saw Richard Walter's personal copy from Ressler. It says, to Richard Walter, my fellow monster hunter. So they were very close. And Rettler invited Walter down to the behavioral science unit a number of times to lecture, but Richard would just say, "Bob, you don't know a thing about sadism, and you haven't been right since 1968." That was like their friendship. and the great insight that Walter and Keppel had was they thought FBI did call bullshit on FBI profiling, because what they thought it was, what they said its problem was, it wasn't really rooted in criminology, it was rooted in psychology. And so the Bureau had gone to psychologists who knew nothing about wading through the blood and had invented these categories. And when some of these FBI agents would then weigh these categories, and they'd have a murder, Keppel called it Kentucky windage. So they'd sit around and they'd say, well, Julio was a fine dresser. I think he was a ladies' man too. You see what I mean? They would try to build these profiles based on, what maybe our aunt and uncle or grandmother would do, be better intuition, if we're going to leave it at that. And Richard Walter and Keppel choose, Richard would turn up his nose in disgust at even the name profiler, because he knew how it had been dragged through the mud, and he thought it deserved some of that mud, even though he was in the corner of the people who were doing this work, because he said preferred to call it crime assessment. And crime assessment, in his view, was the ability to look at, like you said, to look at the woman who was, the manager and on her way up in the Marriott Corporation, and the manager at a hamburger joint, and see that the fact that she was stabbed in the throat and her face was covered, et cetera, is telling us something. We assess the crime first. So his method would be to say, he would basically say, well, for instance, I think I'm a little off on that one, but say a power of killer, okay? So another case that he handled was in Seattle. So a young woman is raped and murdered, just thrown on the side of a street, and abandoned, and her body's just thrown there. And the police have no clues for 10, 20 years, and they come to Richard Walter. And he looks at it, and clearly right from the beginning, he's not interested in the personality of the person and whether or not how they dressed. He's able to right away say, this is a power assertive killing, because the power assertive killer is not interested in what you were talking about earlier, which is the personal relationship with the person and now getting vengeance because their heart's been broken or whatever. It's purely, I want something, you're going to give it to me, and you're a piece of junk, and when I'm done with it, I'm going to throw you beside the road. So he's able to see right away in his sort of paradigm that's a power assertive killer. And then when you study, which he does teach these things, you study his and Keppel's definition of the power assertive killer, well, gee, it's the guy that does drive a black pickup truck. Not that makes you a murderer. It's the guy that does have a Playboy collection. Not that makes you a murderer. It's the guy that if you bump into his bumper, he's gonna come and smack you in the face, kind of guy. And all these things. And so then when the police come to him and say, here are the 20 suspects we've been thinking about for 10 years, it's like, he just starts to describe the personality traits, and the police say, oh my God, that's Simpson. So they know now that Simpson has a pickup truck and the Playboys and the weights and all those other things. Doesn't make him a killer, but makes it worthwhile for him to come back in and get closely questioned. So that's sort of how he provides his help, I think.
Oh, it's all fascinating. And I'm sure that was entertaining, to say the least, just to be around someone like that, and to be around someone that smart, and then for him just be able to pick things apart while everyone else in the room, their wheels are spinning. That's probably a sight to see as well. I always picture him doing that with the cigarette in his mouth and just calmly explaining to people, not why he is smarter than everyone else, but I guess the confidence that I'm getting from someone like that, just be able to confidently say that, yes, this person has all these traits. Yes, this person drives this car and will be living in this location and have this type of job. Oh, and this is what they're going to look like today.
Right. Crazy. Yeah, I got the sort of the tingles when you talked about how special it was to be around him, because you're right. You're hitting the nub of it, which was that, and believe me, he never let me forget that I was freaking Watson. I'm not Watson. His best, but I'm the writing part of Sherlock Holmes, and I don't know crap. And he let me know all the time. And I believe me, I to see what reporters get away with today in the name of arrogance and ignorance, I take that mantle of humility very serious. He's the expert, I'm not. But I did feel privileged to learn from him and to get insights from him. And you're right, he had a tremendous insight and confidence in human nature. It actually seemed to be almost inborn. I mean, he's obviously a genius, but he told me a funny story about when he was at Michigan State University as a psychology student. He was like a sophomore, and he's studying Shakespeare, and one of his favorite professors is teaching about Hamlet, you know, and like Hamlet, Hamlet's father has been murdered, so now Hamlet's going to get revenge, but Hamlet just seems like, his professor is saying, well, Hamlet is just the first modern man. He's got boredom and his confusion and his heart is broken and he doesn't know what to do. And Richard just said as a sophomore, bullshit, he's a psychopath and he's hiding it. And he's going to pull all the strings. And I would have done it in the same way, you know?
That's funny because that was another question I had is when he's doing everyday activities like analyzing books or did you ever play him in cards? That would probably be he'd probably be a fun guy to take to Vegas and have him play poker with people, right?
Yeah, you're right. It would be, and just he would analyze since he became a friend. He would definitely. You could bring him your troubles with your neighbor or your mother-in-law, and he would give a pretty close analysis of what their mind or heart was doing. And so it was, I think it was exciting to know that kind of intellect. But the thing that I found most amazing about him, and I think the book pushes back on, I won't say liberal assumptions, but politically correct assumptions. That, in fact, I did a lecture once at Rutgers University, and they were asking me about Richard Walter, and isn't it someone who does this, and is he some sort of fascist who's just trying to put people in prison? The kind of like nonsense you hear. And I'm like, no, actually, to tell you the truth, what I see in Richard Walter is a tremendous amount of love. Because what he loves, in fact, he would say it. He loves to go out to the corner bar and have meatballs, and there's a carpenter on one side and a beautician on the other. Those are his people, and it's all of our people because he can be around real people and loves humanity and loves what it is to live. Therefore, he's totally fucking outraged when someone tries to steal it. Fucking outraged. And if that isn't love, I don't know what is. One quick story, and I don't want to, but there was a dentist and his wife in Tampa, Florida, and I met them. And this is one of the stories in the book. And they had a beautiful daughter who looked like a much more intelligent version of a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader, and grandchildren. And she was raped and killed in their home in Tampa, in a nice neighborhood in Tampa. And Richard was brought in by they convicted a guy who was a sort of psychopathic gardener. Richard brought in by the father, saying, "I don't trust that the police got it right." And Richard interviewed the killer, said, "Oh no, they got it right." But then Richard found out sometime later, after he went back to Pennsylvania, where he lives in a small town, that the wife whose daughter and grandchildren had been murdered was kind of losing it. She'd lost all interest in cooking. She no longer played music. She used to love to bake. So he got on a plane, flew down to Tampa, Florida, went to her house, knocked on the door, and said, "I understand. Make a tremendous tangerine pie." And she said, well, I guess so. And he said, "Well, we're going to make one right now, God damn it." And he took her out to his car, and Sunday, nothing was open. And they found a tangerine tree behind, I don't know, a diner or something. And he got up and they picked them and brought them home. He said, "Now make it." And if that's not love, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that's very impressive. Not just the work that they do, but that human side of them. And, I think that seeing private citizens doing this type of work, whether it's labs like Othram or people like Richard that are spending their time making the world a better place and going after these monsters, like you said, that's so important for our society as a whole. And so thank you to them and all of law enforcement that are working to catch monsters. And I appreciate you writing this book. I think that the book is The Murder Room. You can pick it up on Amazon, Barnes Noble, Audible, anywhere where you can buy a book. And it's so important to really highlight of what is capable of people as well. And um, so, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing these stories. And uh, I hope that the Vidocq Society continues to grow and helping law enforcement close these cold cases.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Cameron. It's been great to be here. Yeah, I didn't mention the Vidocq Society is named for Eugene Francois Vidocq, who was a Napoleonic era, founder of criminal science. And the book was a New York Times bestseller. I think everything in the New York Times is questionable, but at least they can count book sales. So I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that, by the way. Not a lot of people can say that.
Thank you.
All right. So hopefully this will get turned into a show or a movie or series, right?
Yeah, thanks. Yep. There's a possibility. They're constant interest in it. That's for sure. So, but thank you for your work in law enforcement and your interest in this. I appreciate it.
Is there any other way we can support you or the Vidocq Society?
Oh, well, gosh, I'll think of one. Nothing I can think of right now. Maybe go out and buy the book. That would be great. Tell your friends about it. Um, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And if you're, as far as the Vidocq Society themselves, they're still around. And if you, it's Vidocq is Vidocq, who was this, Eugene Francois Vidocq, this French famous detective way back. And so if you go into Google and put Vidocq Society, their website will come up, and you can keep up with their if they have donations or whatever, but you can keep up with their work. Hopefully the Murder Room will become a show, and you won't have to. It'll be easy for you to find that. That would be great. Thanks. And I hope the more people read it, I'm thrilled.
All right. Well, one more time, Michael Capuzzo, The Murder Room. Again, like Mike was saying, make sure you pick that up and look out for the show. If you want to support me, you can like and subscribe to Santana True Crime. You can also follow me on Instagram, anywhere else on Santana True Crime. And you can pick up my book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop. In North Carolina's most notorious cold case, I wrote that with my brother, Dr. Brian Santana. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show, and good night.
Thank you, Cameron. Good night.